Daniel Carter stood frozen at the kitchen window while the snow outside refused to stop falling. On the other side of that white, empty yard, framed by the fogged glass of the house directly across from his new neighbor turned around. Their eyes met through 2 panes of winter-hazed glass across 30 feet of silence and cold air. He should have looked away. He knew that. A widower, a father he had no business staring. But she didn't frown. She didn't pull the curtain. She only smiled, easy and unhurried, as if she'd caught him at something ordinary, and then said something that stopped the breath in his chest. "Want to see?" And then the curtain drifted closed. Daniel had moved the family to Pine Hollow in October, 6 weeks after Laura's funeral, when it became clear that staying in their old house, where the kitchen still smelled faintly of her shampoo and Sophie still pressed her ear to the wall of the master bedroom at night, was doing neither of them any good. The town was small, quiet, and far enough from everything they'd known that starting over felt at least structurally possible, even if it felt emotionally absurd. By December, snow had buried the yard, the front walkway, and most of Daniel's better instincts. He had built a routine out of sheer necessity, the way a man might build a wall from whatever rubble is at hand. 5:30 in the morning. Alarm. He lay still for exactly 2 minutes, looking at the ceiling, allowing himself that much before swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. He had read somewhere that grief moved in waves. What no one mentioned was that the waves came whether or not you were standing on solid ground. 6 o'clock. Lunches packed. Sophie was 8 and had strong opinions about the sandwich-to-fruit ratio in her lunchbox. She would not eat apple slices if the apple had been cut more than an hour before school. She had explained this to him 3 times, with the patient gravity of someone instructing a slow student, and he had started setting a phone reminder. Small victories. 6:45. The walk to Pine Hollow Elementary, which was 4 blocks away along a sidewalk that the town's sole maintenance worker, an elderly man named Mr. Garrett, heroically salted each morning. Sophie wore a red wool coat that had been Laura's choice the previous February, and Daniel sometimes couldn't look at it straight on, the way you can't look directly at the sun. He had, in the weeks since moving in, learned the names of 3 neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, who were in their 70s and left casseroles on his porch at intervals too regular to be coincidental. Young Brendan Walsh, who worked nights and could be seen jogging at dawn with the dedication of someone outrunning something, and the woman in the house across the narrow yard to his right. Her name, he had gathered from a piece of mail misdelivered to his door, was Emma Voss. She was perhaps 35, though he couldn't be certain. She lived alone. She maintained a small garden that she continued to tend even in winter, wrapping certain shrubs in burlap, cutting back the ornamental grasses with a precision that looked almost meditative. He had watched her do this more than once from his kitchen window while waiting for the coffee to finish. He always told himself he was watching the snow. He told himself a lot of things that December. The morning, everything shifted. He had been standing at that window at 6:15, mug in hand, steam rising between his face and the glass. The yard was white and unbroken. The sky above the roofline was the flat gray of old stone, and Emma Voss, in the kitchen directly across that narrow yard, had turned from her stove and looked up. They'd looked at each other through 2 panes of fogged glass, across 30 feet of snow-buried silence, and neither of them had moved. He should have stepped back. He'd known that. She smiled, tilted her head just slightly. Her lips moved. "Want to see?" The curtain fell. Daniel set his mug down on the counter, very carefully, and stood there for a long time. He didn't sleep well for 3 nights afterward. This was not entirely new. Insomnia had been a companion since the accident, slipping in beside him in the dark hours with a reliability that almost felt like company. But this was different. The other kind of sleeplessness was grief, and he had learned its geography. This was something else, and its unfamiliarity unsettled him in a way that felt, on its surface, too close to guilt. On the first night, he lay in the dark and told himself the smile had been reflexive, the kind of expression anyone might produce upon being caught looking through a window. Sheepish acknowledgement. Human reflex. On the second night, he admitted to himself that the words had not been reflexive. You didn't say want to see by accident. You had to decide to say that. On the third night, he sat up at 2 a.m, went downstairs, and made himself a cup of chamomile tea he didn't want. He stood at the kitchen window, dark, now, her house dark, and held the warm mug and tried to reconstruct what he knew about the situation with some degree of clinical detachment. Fact. His wife had been dead for 4 months. Fact. He had not had a conversation with a woman that wasn't transactional. Thank you. Have a good day. Yes. She likes extra napkins in approximately that same period. Fact. He was 38 years old and had been deeply, completely, unreservedly in love with a woman who was gone, and the only person who had made him feel something in the vicinity of curiosity in 4 months was a neighbor he had never spoken to. He also could not explain, under cross-examination, why the words want to see had lodged themselves so cleanly under his sternum. She had been standing at her kitchen stove in what looked like a cream-colored robe, the kind worn not for anyone else's benefit but for warmth, for comfort, for the simple privacy of early morning in one's own home. There had been steam rising from something on the stove, he had thought, absurdly, of soup, of winter soups, of the specific warmth of kitchens in cold weather. The light behind her had been warm-toned. The window glass had been misted at its edges from the contrast between the heated interior and the frozen exterior. And through that frame, she had looked, simply, like someone who was at home in her own life. He hadn't felt at home in his own life for 4 months. He poured the tea down the sink and went back to bed. In the morning, he woke at 5:30, made Sophie's lunch, cut the apple early by accident, received a look of quiet reproach from his daughter, and walked her to school through the snow without looking at Emma Voss's house even once. He managed this for 4 days. The storm arrived on a Thursday afternoon with the kind of disregard for human scheduling that winter routinely demonstrates. By Friday morning, it had deposited 14 inches of snow across Pine Hollow, and, in doing so, had collapsed the shared wooden fence between Daniel's yard and Emma Voss's. He discovered this at 8 o'clock when he went to the shed for the snow shovel and found a gap where the center section of the fence had been. 3 posts down, the boards splayed outward like a question the storm had felt the need to pose. He was standing there in his coat, assessing the damage with the expression of a man who has added one more thing to a list that already exceeds capacity, when he heard the creak of her back door. Emma Voss came out in a heavy canvas jacket, work gloves already on, carrying a cordless drill and a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of tools. She assessed the damage from her side of the collapsed fence, then looked up at him across it without apparent surprise at finding him there. "Happened to mine 2 winters ago," she said. "The middle sections always go first. The posts get saturated, freeze, and then one good storm and that's it." He hadn't planned on saying anything. "I was just going to prop it up for now. Propping it won't hold." "You need to reset the posts." She crouched beside one of the downed boards and examined the base of the nearest post. "This one's still solid. These 2 are the problem." He stood there for a moment, and then he went to his shed and got his own tools. They worked for 2 hours in the February cold without very much conversation, which turned out to be exactly the kind of company Daniel hadn't known he needed. Emma had opinions about fence repair that were grounded in actual knowledge. She explained the frost line issue, the importance of using the right post-hole depth for the climate, and he listened and followed her lead, which was not something he did easily with people he'd just met, and did not examine too closely why it came easily with her. Sophie came home from school at 3:15 and stopped on the back steps, watching them. "Who's that?" she asked Daniel. "Emma. She lives next door." Sophie regarded Emma with the frank assessment of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't doing it. "You have good gloves," she said. "Thank you," Emma said. "They were my dad's. He was a carpenter." "My dad can't fix things," Sophie said. "He fixed the fence, though." A pause. "Mostly." Daniel opened his mouth. Emma caught his eye briefly, and he could see, behind her composure, the beginning of a smile. He closed his mouth, mostly as usually enough, Emma said to Sophie. Later, after Emma had gone back inside and Sophie was at the kitchen table with her homework, Daniel stood at the sink, washing his hands, and realized that at some point during those 2 hours he had laughed. Not the performative laugh he produced when Sophie said something funny and he needed her to see that he'd heard her, but the actual involuntary kind. The kind that catches you off guard. He hadn't made note of the moment while it was happening. That, he thought, was probably significant. It happened in increments, the way weather changes not all at once, but through the accumulation of minor shifts that you only notice in retrospect. Emma brought soup, not with announcement or fanfare, but simply appearing at his door on a Tuesday evening with a container of something that smelled of leek and potato and winter root vegetables, saying she'd made too much. He thanked her and she handed it over, and that was the entire exchange, which lasted approximately 45 seconds and which he found himself thinking about on and off for the rest of the evening. The following Saturday, he was attempting to help Sophie build a snowman in the backyard, and the head kept collapsing because the snow was too dry and powdery for proper packing. Sophie had moved through impatience into a focused, silent form of engineering problem-solving that looked very much like her mother, and Daniel was crouched beside her trying to think of structural solutions when Emma appeared at the gap in the fence with a spray bottle of water. "Mist it as you pack," she said. "Just enough to give it some cohesion." Sophie looked at the spray bottle, then at Emma, then at Daniel, with the expression of someone who has just realized an adult actually knows what they're doing. "Okay," she said, and held out her hand. They built the snowman together. Emma showed Sophie how to compact the snow from the bottom up, how to add handfuls of dry snow to fill the gaps. Daniel stood to one side and watched his daughter's face entirely focused, entirely in the moment, entirely free. Just then, of the shadow that had settled over her since October and felt something in his chest that had no adequate name. Emma did not stay long after the snowman was finished. She handed the spray bottle back, complimented the construction, and returned through the fence gap. Sophie watched her go. "Is she your friend?" Sophie asked. "I think so," Daniel said, which was more than he'd intended to say, and also, he thought, probably accurate. He started noticing her light in the morning. Not because he was watching, he told himself, but because the kitchen window was directly in front of the coffee maker, and it required no particular effort to observe whether the light across the narrow yard was on or off. When it was on, the feeling was not quite relief, and not quite warmth, and not quite anything else he had a precise word for. He catalogued it without labeling it, and moved on with his morning. The snow kept falling. Pine Hollow in February accumulated it in layers, each storm building on the last, so that the yard became a kind of geological record of the winter, and the path between his back door and the fence gap wore down into a track through the white. Sophie used it first, then he did, then Emma did. And it was only sometime in early March that he realized the path had become, through sheer repetition, a fact of the yard. The evening it happened was a Friday in March, when the temperature had dropped sharply after a brief thaw, and the porch steps were glazed with ice that neither of them had attended to. They were sitting on Daniel's back porch with cups of coffee that had gone mostly cold, which was both of their faults for staying out past the point of reasonable cold weather wisdom. He had not planned on telling her about Laura. He had not planned on telling anyone anything. The topic had a texture he avoided, rough-edged, capable of drawing blood, and in the months since October, he had learned to move around it the way you learn the layout of a dark room. But something about the cold and the dark, and the particular quality of the silence, the way Pine Hollow went very quiet on Friday nights, a small-town stillness that was actually restful once you stopped waiting for it to mean something bad, made him less careful than usual. He told her about the accident, March 3rd of the previous year. Laura had gone to pick up groceries on her way back from her sister's place, and somewhere between the grocery store and home, A driver who had run a red light had taken away the last 8 years of Daniel's life in approximately 1 second. He said this plainly, in the way he had learned to say plain things plainly, because the alternative was that the words swelled up around the edges and became something he couldn't finish. He told her about the last text message. He had been at the office, and she had sent him a message at 2:47 in the afternoon, which was 14 minutes before the accident, which he knew because he had, in the weeks after, done the math more times than was strictly healthy. The message said, "Don't forget the milk." He had forgotten the milk. He had also forgotten it every week since, in a way that had nothing to do with forgetfulness. Emma was quiet for a while. The cold settled around them. He waited for the usual responses, the condolences, the gentle redirections, the offers of perspective, and was quietly grateful when none of them came. "My husband left 4 years ago," she said finally, "which I know isn't the same thing. He's alive. He just decided he didn't want to be where I was anymore." A pause. "I used to think that was easier. I've stopped thinking that." He looked at her. She was holding her cup with both hands, looking out at the dark yard. "The not knowing is different," she said. "With death, there's a reason. With someone leaving, there's a choice they made. You keep asking yourself what the choice means about you." He hadn't thought about it that way. He said so. "We're both just people who got left," she said, which was simultaneously the most reductive and most accurate description of the situation he had heard. They stayed on the porch until the cold became genuinely unreasonable, and then went inside to their respective houses through the dark yard, and Daniel stood in his kitchen for a while without turning the light on. The gossip in Pine Hollow was not malicious. It was simply present. The way drafts are present in old houses, not a structural problem, but a constant, minor chill that you were always dimly aware of. Mrs. Holloway mentioned, during one of her casserole deliveries in late March, that several neighbors had noticed the light on late at both houses simultaneously on Friday evenings. She said this with her eyes aimed sideways and an expression of theatrical neutrality that fooled neither of them. Daniel thanked her for the casserole and said nothing. He learned about Lucas secondhand. On a Saturday afternoon, when he was in the backyard resetting one of the fence post anchors that had worked loose again in the spring thaw, he heard Emma's voice through the fence, low and deliberate, the cadence of someone navigating a familiar difficulty. He wasn't close enough to hear the words, and he wasn't trying to listen. But then her voice rose enough for a sentence to carry through. "I'm not Lucas. I'm not ready to be someone's mother. That's not a conversation I'm in." A pause. A man's voice, muffled, on what must have been a phone. No, it's not about him. It's not about anyone. I'm telling you where I am." Daniel set down the post anchor and went inside. He was not entitled to feel anything about what he'd heard. He understood this. He hadn't been eavesdropping intentionally, and whatever he'd absorbed in those 10 seconds was not information he was supposed to have, and whatever Emma Voss's relationship status or internal negotiations were, they were categorically none of his business. He told himself this in the kitchen. Then he told it to himself again while making Sophie's dinner. Then he spent an evening that was several degrees quieter than usual, which Sophie noticed but did not comment on, because she was 8 years old and had, in the past several months, developed a finely calibrated sense of when to leave her father alone with whatever he was working through. The following week, Emma brought back a book he'd lent her and left it on the porch without knocking. The week after that, when Sophie waved at her across the fence and Emma waved back, she smiled but didn't come over. He understood. He also, despite himself, minded. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and he had enough self-awareness to recognize that the second thing complicated his certainty about the first. He stopped looking at her kitchen window in the mornings. He made himself stop. He set the coffee maker on a timer so that it would be finished before he came downstairs, which removed the standing at the counter moment entirely. It was a small architectural adjustment to his morning, and it worked approximately 40% of the time, which he told himself was acceptable. In April, Daniel enrolled Sophie in a Saturday art class at the Pine Hollow Community Center, began attending the Monday evening neighborhood association meetings. Even though the meetings were largely concerned with matters he had no particular interest in, and volunteered to help organize the elementary school's spring fundraiser, which entailed 3 separate Tuesday evenings sitting at a folding table with other parents and deciding on raffle prizes. He was very busy. Busyness had excellent reviews as a grief management strategy, and he applied it with the thoroughness he brought to most things. Sophie came home from her second art class with a painting of a house. His house, recognizably she had included the specific shape of the kitchen window, but also Emma's house, side by side, connected by a path through white ground that might have been snow or might have been some other kind of whiteness. She had painted it carefully, with the methodical deliberateness she brought to things she was serious about. "Who lives in the other house?" he asked, because it seemed important to ask directly rather than around the edges of things. "Emma," Sophie said, which was both the obvious answer and, somehow, more than the obvious answer. "Just the 2 houses? And us. And Emma. That's 3. She looked at him with the patience of someone who suspects the other person is deliberately missing the point. "Dad. You only smile when you're pretending." He opened his mouth, and nothing came out. "At school I smile for real and for pretend, and they feel different," Sophie continued, with the focused calm of a child making a technical distinction. "Your pretend smile has a line here." She touched the space between her own eyebrows. "Your real smile doesn't." Daniel sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at the painting. He looked at his daughter, who had the direct, unmanipulative gaze of someone who is simply reporting what she has observed. "Sophie," he said. "You don't have to explain," she said. "I just thought you should know." She took the painting and went to put it in her room, and Daniel stayed at the table for a long time. He thought about what it meant to spend months in careful motion, forward-facing, organized and present and functional, and to have his 8-year-old see through every layer of it in about 4 seconds. He thought about what he was teaching her. That loss was something you survived by appearing not to have survived anything. That forward motion was its own form of standing still. That smiling for pretend and smiling for real were both acceptable responses to being alive when they plainly weren't. He had been so afraid, he realized, of wanting something, as if wanting something constituted a betrayal of Laura, or a naivety about what the world could take, or a foolishness he was too old and too acquainted with grief to permit himself, as if happiness, attempted and lost again, would be worse than happiness never tried. He sat at the kitchen table until it was dark outside, and then he went upstairs and looked at the painting for a long time in Sophie's room while she slept, and then he went to bed and lay awake with the specific calm of someone who has finally figured out what they're actually afraid of. The thing about fear, he had learned over the past several months, was that it was not always recognizable as itself. It came dressed as prudence, as responsibility, as respect for the gravity of grief. It said, "You are being careful." It said, "You are being appropriate." It said, "This is what a good father does, a good widower. A man who understands the weight of what he has lost." It did not say, "You are afraid." It did not say, "You have chosen the wall because you cannot tolerate the thought of losing anything again, and so you have decided not to want anything that could be lost." Sophie had seen through all of it in under 30 seconds. His 8-year-old daughter, who counted apple slices and had opinions about sparrows, had looked at his face and known the difference between the real thing and the performance. And if she could see it, he thought, then it was not actually hidden. It was simply unaddressed. And there was a difference. He knocked on her door at 6 in the morning, before the light had fully arrived. He was aware of how this looked. He was aware that 6 in the morning was a time for emergencies or very important things, and that his arrival on her porch at this hour required the implicit declaration that this was one or the other. He had knocked before he could talk himself into waiting for a more reasonable hour, because waiting for a more reasonable hour was exactly the kind of maneuver he had been executing for months. Emma answered the door in the cream-colored robe, the same one from the kitchen window, that first morning and looked at him without alarm. Whatever she read in his face, it apparently read as something other than emergency. "It's early," she said. "I know." He had planned something to say. He'd organized it in the kitchen over the past hour. A straightforward, declarative account of where he was and what he wanted and what he wasn't asking for. It had been reasonably eloquent in the rehearsal. Standing on her porch in the 6 o'clock dark, he couldn't find the beginning of it. "I'm not looking for someone to replace Laura," he said, because that at least was true and immediate and somewhere near the actual point. I'm not interested in replacement. There isn't a version of this where someone fills that." She waited. "I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear a few weeks ago, about not being ready to be someone's mother. And I want you to know that's not Sophie doesn't need another mother. She has a mother. She'll always have a mother." He stopped, restarted. "What I'm trying to say is that I'm not trying to find someone to complete something. I think I'm just trying to figure out how to be alive again. In the actual sense of it, not just present. Alive." The porch light caught the side of her face. She was looking at him with something he couldn't immediately classify, not pity, and not the careful, neutral expression she sometimes wore, but something more exposed than either. "I'm afraid of being left again," she said. "Not by you specifically. By anyone who matters. It's gotten very organized, my life, very arranged. I can see every part of it from where I stand, and nothing can come at me sideways." She looked at her hands, the work-worn gloves absent this time. "I've been protecting that for 4 years, and I'm honestly not sure it's been good for me. I'm not going to promise anything perfect," he said. "I don't have any perfect things to offer. I'm not asking for perfect." "Then what are you asking for?" She looked at him. The sky behind the roofline was beginning to gray. The first faint signal of dawn arriving over Pine Hollow. "Honest," she said. "Just honest. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. "That one I can do." She stepped back and held the door open, and he came in from the cold. Emma did not move in. This was not discussed at length. It was simply understood, in the way that certain things between people who have both been badly surprised by life tend to be understood without requiring formal articulation. Her house was hers, and his house was his and Sophie's, and the space between them, the yard, the fence gap, the well-worn path through the grass that replaced the snowpath once May arrived, was a kind of shared territory that belonged to no one in particular, and to all of them in practice. She was there on Tuesday evenings for dinner, and on Sunday mornings sometimes, and on the occasional Saturday, when a project exceeded what one person could reasonably manage alone. She was not there in the way of someone filling a designated space. She was there in the way of someone who had decided, carefully and with full knowledge of her own reluctance, that this particular set of people was worth showing up for. Sophie, for her part, treated this development with the philosophical composure of a child who has identified a situation as good and sees no need to over-discuss it. She taught Emma the specific rules regarding apple slices and lunchbox timing. She showed Emma the 14-step process she had developed for feeding the neighborhood sparrows without attracting the larger and less welcome starlings. She did not call Emma anything in particular, not by name, not by any title, and this, Daniel came to understand, was its own form of deliberateness. Some things didn't need a label to be real. In June, Sophie came home from school with a painting she'd made in art class. It was a house, his house, with 3 figures in front of it, rendered in the particular style of an 8-year-old who is serious about her work. Careful proportions, deliberate color choices, a sky that was an optimistic and factually questionable shade of yellow gold. At the bottom, in her careful printing, she had written, "My happy family." He found it on the kitchen table when he came down from putting her to bed, and he stood looking at it for a long time, not with the particular weight of grief this time, which he had half expected, but with something that felt more like recognition, as if the painting had named something accurately that he hadn't quite found the words for himself. He took a photograph of it and sent it to no one. Some things you just hold. He thought about Laura. He thought about her with love and with grief, and also, for the first time, without the familiar accompaniment of guilt. Laura had loved him completely and impractically, and with the kind of wholeheartedness that had made him, at various points over 8 years, feel both profoundly fortunate and faintly terrified of losing it. She would not have wanted him standing still. He knew this. She had been constitutionally incapable of endorsing anything that looked like giving up. Don't forget the milk. The last message. The ordinary imperative of a shared life, so routine that it had been sent without a second thought on a Tuesday afternoon in March, with no awareness that it was the last Tuesday afternoon in March that would ever work out that way. He kept the message. He had never decided not to, but he had also, very quietly, started buying milk again without being reminded. It was a December morning, almost a year to the day from the first one. Daniel was standing at the kitchen window at 6:15 with his coffee, which he now made himself rather than setting on a timer, because he had stopped needing to engineer around the window. The yard beyond the glass was buried in a fresh 4 inches of overnight snow. The path between the fence gap and the houses was not visible yet. It would need to be broken again each winter, a small, seasonal renewal. Sophie was upstairs getting dressed for school, engaged in a conversation with herself about which of her 2 red wool coats was more appropriate for the temperature, a deliberation she conducted each morning with increasing meteorological sophistication. She had, this year, started checking the actual weather. Across the narrow yard, in the warm-lit kitchen of the house directly opposite, Emma turned from the stove. She looked up. He was already looking. Neither of them moved. It was, he thought, a strange and precise thing the way a moment can recur and be completely different from itself. The same yard, the same windows, the same morning cold, the same 2 people on either side of the glass. Everything that had changed was invisible to any outside observer. Emma smiled. Not the polite, careful smile from a year ago. Something looser. Something that had given up on being careful. She tilted her head toward her back door. Her lips moved. Want to see? He understood now that she had never been asking about the kitchen. She had been asking in the shorthand of a person who has learned not to ask for too much too directly, whether he was the kind of person who would step toward an unknown thing rather than away from it. Whether, in other words, he was still alive in the particular sense that mattered. He set down his coffee. He called upstairs. "Sophie, 5 minutes." "I know," Sophie called back, from the middle of her meteorological calculations. He went to the back door and opened it. The cold came in with the sharp clarity of December air, the kind that makes the inside of your chest feel new. He crossed the yard, through the snow, leaving the first tracks of the morning in 4 inches of white. The fence gap was where it had always been. He went through it. Emma held her back door open and stepped aside to let him in. And he came in from the cold and the snow and the particular quality of winter morning that had always lived on the other side of a window, and he stood in her kitchen, which smelled of coffee and something baking, and the specific warmth of a house that is genuinely inhabited, and looked around. "Yeah," he said. She poured him a cup of coffee without asking how he took it, because she knew by now, and they stood at her kitchen window together and looked out at the yard, at the single set of tracks he'd left in the snow from his back door to hers, at the 2 houses side by side under the white December sky. He was not without grief. He didn't expect to be. Grief, he had come to understand, was not a condition you recovered from. It was a thing you learned to carry, and the carrying changed shape over time but didn't end, and that was acceptable, more than acceptable. The grief was the mark of the thing that had been real. What was different was the fear that had kept him standing at windows, engineering his mornings, substituting motion for living. That fear had not disappeared, but he had stopped, somewhere in the past year, letting it make his decisions for him. He was at peace. Not because the hurt was gone, and not because the future was legible, and not because everything had resolved itself into something clean and final. He was at peace because he was no longer afraid. Sophie's voice floated across the yard, through both sets of walls. "Dad." 5 minutes was a long time ago. Emma looked at him over the rim of her cup. He looked back. He went home through the snow to take his daughter to school, leaving 2 sets of tracks in the yard now, and the morning continued, the way mornings do.